Hello, pilgrims through hell. Welcome to episode 2 of Old English, the beginnings of the English language. In our last unit, we looked at Sir William Jones's discovery that Latin and Greek shared roots with Sanskrit, and the ultimate discovery that most of the languages of Europe are cognate or related to the languages of northern India. We looked at the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European roots, and we surveyed the major branches of the Indo-European language family, including Indic, with Sanskrit right here, Greek, Iranian, Balto-Slavic, the Romance languages, which descend from Latin, the Celtic languages. We mentioned briefly the Anatolian languages, which are extinct, including Hittite, spoken by Uriah the Hittite. Of course, the Germanic languages, the Scandinavian languages, and we located English very specifically on the low branch of the Western division of the Western Germanic languages, and you can see that split right here. Well, today we're going to zero in on English and tell its story, and the characters who play roles in this story are all represented on this chart. It's important to recognize that the different influences and migrations and interactions and conquests that produced English involved interactions of linguistic cousins on this tree. They include some of the earlier forms of the Western Germanic languages here, such as the Angles and Saxons and Jutes. It includes Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, and it includes several Celtic languages, including Breton, Welsh, and Scottish. To understand the story of the beginnings of English, we need to get oriented to three main periods in the early history of Britain, because it's the changing of those groups which gave us the English language. So, three groups who ruled the British Isles. First, the Celts. You recall that a couple thousand years ago, this was the group you wanted to place your money on. They were spread throughout Western Europe, and they occupied all of the British Isles. They spoke languages which were largely mutually comprehensible, dialects of what we call Brittonic, and they were spread throughout the British Isles, beginning somewhere around 600 BC and ending in 43 AD. Well, what did these people look like? We think they looked something like this. Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart. And we think that they probably spent their time river dancing. No, that's just all a bit of silliness to help you remember that the Celts were the first inhabitants of the British Isles. They were actually an Iron Age people. We have some of their weapons. They were farmers. They built hill forts, which you can still see ruins of in England. And religiously, they were Druids involved in various kinds of nature worship. It'll be important later to understand two branches of the Celtic language involved in these migrations. First of all, to the north, the Gaelic languages. Both of these coincide with modern countries, Ireland to the west, and Scotland there sitting on top of England, the Gaelic language. And we speak of Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic. There's another group of Celtic in the islands to the south, which includes Welsh, and that does correspond to the modern nation of Wales, which is part of Great Britain, but also Cornish in the sort of southwestern part of England, and Breton, which is actually in the northwest part of France. Just look at the placement of the Celtic languages on the map. Having once occupied much of continental Europe and the Isles, don't they look like they've been pushed west and north so that they're almost clinging for their existence to the western edge of continental Europe? You also see Manx on the map. That refers to a specific Celtic language spoken right there on the Isle of Man. It went extinct not long ago. And the same thing will likely happen to Cornish, spoken here in what's called Land's End. That's where the Land's End Clothing Company gets its name from. It's Cornwall as a part of England, but they speak a Celtic language here. And there was a survey in 2010 which showed that there were only about 300 native speakers of Cornish, so that will soon join the list of extinct languages. And here, on the northwest coast of France, speakers of Breton, a language related within the Brittonic branch of Celtic. I have always enjoyed Celtic music, and I love listening to it spoken or sung, but I never attempt to pronounce anything in Celtic because I'm never sure what sounds the letters are going to make. This, though, is a modern Irish Gaelic proverb. Here's what it means. It means, may the cat eat you and the devil eat the cat. And I just love it that you can get that on a t-shirt. And looking through the internet, I'm pretty sure that's the cat they were talking about. Anyway, what happened in 43 AD which brought an end to Celtic rule of Britain? Well, the same thing that was happening to much of Europe and North Africa all the way over to the Middle East, and that is the Roman Empire. After an unsuccessful attempt by Julius Caesar several years before, in 43 AD the Emperor Claudius conquered Britain. Notice on the map on the top right, Rome never conquered the Scots north of originally the Antonine Wall, but after that the Hadrian's Wall. And I've walked a good part of this wall right here. You can still walk along it. It's made of giant stones, and it marked the northwestmost reach of the Roman Empire. But the Romans, as outstanding as they were as warriors, never conquered the Scottish, and they never conquered the Irish. Well, beginning in 43 AD, there were 350 plus years of Roman rule over the Celtic Britons. And while Britain was part of the Roman Empire, the Romans did what they do. They imposed the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, bringing an end to fighting among the Celtic tribes. There were Roman soldiers stationed throughout what they called Britannia. The Romans were great builders also, and they built these roads and as well as walls. Some of England's large highways are built over those Roman roads, but others you can still see, like the one in the map in the middle, meandering their way through the wonderful English countryside. They also built 100 or so cities, including Londinium, which became London, of course. Most people would have continued to speak a Celtic language, but the elites, those who traded with or were in government, would have spoken Latin during this time. Well, if the Roman Empire arrived in 43 AD, what happened in 410? In 410, a series of events was set in motion that would stir the linguistic and ethnic pot of Europe, set off waves of migrations, and lead to the beginnings of the English language. Do you remember the eastern branch of the Germanic-speaking peoples, the Goths, we called them? Germanic groups, including the Goths, also the Vandals, had been pressing in on Rome for some time, and in 410, those Visigoths sacked Rome and began the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So if we go back to the first decade of the 5th century, Rome starts recalling its troops from distant outposts from the Middle East, Northern Africa, from all the way in the west in England, to defend the heartland, to defend their capital. Now this might have seemed like winning the lottery for the Celts, who would get their land back from their Roman overlords, but in fact it was closer to the opposite. Like Rome, Britain was hemmed in by warlike tribes. They were threatened from the north by the Picts and the Scots, and from the continent by Germanic tribes. The Britons actually sent requests to Rome saying, help us defend ourselves from the peoples around us, because over the 300 years of Roman rule, they had lost their ability to defend themselves. They'd become less warlike. But Rome was busy collapsing, and they refused to send aid. So what did the native Britons do? The Celtic Britons turned to mercenaries, hired fighters. And who in the ancient world, if you've been paying any attention, are you going to hire as your mercenaries? Germanic tribes. And the three tribes they mainly turned to were the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. So who exactly were these continental Germanic tribes? The map on the right shows what is modern Denmark, essentially a peninsula, a lump on the head of Germany sticking up into the North Sea. Denmark is in the top right of this map. So who exactly were these continental Germanic tribes? Let's take them one at a time. The Angles lived in the central part, and the name Angle is very important because it gives us the word English. Well, angle was an early Germanic word for a hook, or specifically a fish hook. The word actually survives in the modern English word for fisher, angler, to go angling. And the German word for to fish is Angel. And the reason for that is probably because you fish with an angled piece of wire or metal. Well, how did they get this name originally? They were fishers, likely, but also look at the shape of the peninsula they're living in. It looks kind of like a hook sticking up into the North Sea. So here's a fish hook to help you remember the Angles. The other major group of mercenaries who came to Britain after the Romans had left were the Saxons, a group that lived in northern Germany over into the Netherlands and also southern Denmark. And their name, Saxons, comes from an old Germanic word sax, which meant axe or blade. And that in turn had come from a Proto-Indo-European root sec, which gives us words like section and segment and dissect. Kind of ominous sounding words, right? So the Saxons were literally swordsmen or axemen. Here's a picture of an actual Saxon sword and a reconstruction below it to help you remember the Saxons were swordmen. The Jutes played a relatively minor role, so we won't have much to say about them. Let's look at this map and see if we can predict the future. With warlike tribes of the Scots and the Picts pressing on them from the north and the west, and Germanic tribes, Jutes, Angles, and Saxons being invited to help them fight, what do you think is going to happen to the Britons? If you follow this blue line, you actually see what happens to some of them as they get pressed out of their original homeland. This, of course, is Cornwall, and a pocket remains there as they flee. And this, of course, is Brittany, where Breton is spoken. So there's a kind of diaspora. And who are the people who live there? Refugees of the people who occupied England before it became England. Before we return to the plight of the Celtic Britons, we need to pause for a moment of celebration. Hacking, hewing, and killing aside, something profound was about to happen in the history of language. And that is the first spoken word of English. We can actually track this down to one specific event. I can't tell you where the event happened, or who was involved, or what the first spoken word was, but it must have been precisely this. When Angles and Saxons boarded boats on the continent, the members of those boats were speaking Germanic dialects. They then crossed the English Channel to come and work as mercenaries and then later invade and settle in Britain. And whatever it was that they first said when their boat first touched ground in the island of Britain, that was the first word of spoken English. Not that they were aware of this, of course, and not that the language had changed, but it is this migration of the invited mercenaries who end up overtaking the native Britons and establishing themselves as the Anglo-Saxon inhabitants of England that is the beginning of the language that I am speaking to you right now. And it just so happens that through painstaking historical reconstruction, we've narrowed down the possibilities for the first English sentence to one of the following. I do hope I'm interrupting something. I wonder you don't just set fire to the Abbey and dance around it. Don't be defeatist, dear. It's very middle class. You have a straightforward choice. You must choose either death or life. I'd like to apologize for that. I'm a big fan of Downton Abbey, and Maggie Smith as the Dowager Countess is one of my favorite characters. No, none of these was the first line of English, though. She has a sharp tongue, and a couple of those actually might not be too far off. Anyway, some really terrible events ensued as the Anglo-Saxons overran Britain. And perhaps the best source we have is a native account. It's from about a century later, sometime in the 6th century, by a cleric named Gildas in a book cheerfully titled On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. Here is how Gildas describes the arrival of the Angles and Saxons. The fire spread from sea to sea, fed by the hands of our foes in the east, and did not cease until, destroying the neighboring towns and lands, it reached the other side of the island and dipped its red and savage tongue in the western ocean. In these assaults, all the columns were leveled. Those would be Roman columns, by the way, with the ground by the frequent strokes of the battering ram. All the farmers routed together with their bishops, priests, and people, whilst the sword gleamed and the flames crackled around them on every side. Lamentable to behold, in the midst of the streets lay the tops of lofty towers tumbled to the ground, stones of high walls, holy altars, fragments of human bodies, covered with livid clots of coagulated blood, looking as if They had been squeezed together in a press, and with no chance of being buried, save in the ruins of the houses or in the ravening bellies of wild beasts and birds. Centuries later, once the Angles and Saxons had killed off or forced out the native Britons, they began a chronicle, which is a sort of national diary with short, dated entries. The chronicle was not begun until about 900 AD, but it begins with an entry for 447. And before I show you that account of these events, we should realize that this account should be taken with a grain of salt, and for two good reasons. First, it's dealing with events that happened 400 plus years before, half a millennium almost, for which there are no contemporary accounts. Even Gildas was a century later. And it was written by the winners. It's the winners, those who are left standing, who get to write history. So here's the account from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In 449, now we have names, Hengist and Horsa, the leaders of the Anglo-Saxons. We don't know if those names are apocryphal, if they're made up, traditional. There's no evidence of those names from the preceding century. We're invited by Vortigern, again, this king of the Britons. That's perhaps a later invention. There's no attestation of that name from earlier on. So Hengist and Horsa were invited by Vortigern, king of the Britons. Notice that this is the conquering, winning people saying, we were invited here. Sought out Britain in the landing place named Ebba's Creek, at first to help the Britons, but later they fought against them. The king ordered them to fight against the Picts, and they did so and had victory wherever they came. We were successful. They then sent to Anglia. Notice what's happening now. The Angles and Saxons, brought as invited mercenaries to fight the Britons' wars for them, send to the continent and ordered them to send more help and to tell them of the worthlessness of the Britons and of the excellence of the land. And you can see where that's leading. Mercenary work is turning into immigration, which will turn into conquest. They then sent them more help. These men came from 3 tribes of Germany, from the Old Saxons, the Angles, and from the Jutes. Fast forward 6 years, Hengist and Horsa now fight against Vortigern, the king of the Britons, in the place which is called Aylesford, and his brother Horsa was killed, and after that Hengist and Ash his son succeeded to the kingdom. Fast forward 2 more years, Hengist and Ash fought against the Britons in Crayford and killed 4,000 men, and the Britons abandoned the land of Kent in the southeast, and in great terror fled to the stronghold of London. Fast forward a generation, Hengist and Ash fight against the Welsh, and I'll note something about them in a moment, and seized countless war loot, and the Welsh fled from the English. There I'm using the Old English spelling of English, like fire. Welsh. Who are the Welsh exactly? Well, forced west by the invading Anglo-Saxons, the Celtic Britons merged with and helped to become the Welsh. So if you look at this map, we can see how these wanderings and invasions gave us what we think of as modern Great Britain. The Angles settled in the Midlands, and you see there the Middle Angles and the South Angles, and over here the East Angles. The Saxons tended to settle more toward the southern coast, below and just above the River Thames. You see the East Saxons, the Middle Saxons, the West Saxons, and down here the South Saxons. Well, where are Britons? It's an unhappy comparison, but they're in a sort of reservation in the Native American sense. They've been pushed west to the Land's End here in Cornwall, and here to the western edge of the island of England. And the different invading Germanic tribes form what's called the Heptarchy. Originally, there are 7 different ruling groups in England of the Germanic peoples. And you see the Angles and the West Saxons and the South Saxons now in places called Wessex and Sussex. Well, what is Wessex and Sussex? If you've spent any time in England or reading news about England, you've heard of Wessex and Sussex, and also Essex. Well, Essex is the East Saxons. Sussex is the South Saxons. The Jutes, by the way, settled here in Kent. Cornwall is over here, with its pockets of Celtic speakers, Wales becomes the nation of Wales. So think, where did the Welsh come from? Wales is a sort of reservation onto which the original inhabitants of England were pushed by the Anglo-Saxons. So looking at what these places look like today, we have Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England. Several of these lands speak Celtic languages. Scotland, Wales, Ireland, as well as pockets elsewhere. And England does not speak a Celtic language. It speaks a Germanic language. By the way, now's a good time to tell you briefly the story, to the extent that we know it, of Rex Arturus, which is Latin for King Arthur. The King Arthur stories, which had to be the soap opera, the ongoing saga of the entire Middle Ages, culminating in Malory's La Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, in about the 1500s, begins in exactly this time and in these events. Unfortunately, though, there's very little historical evidence for anything you probably think of when you imagine the Arthurian saga. First of all, there's no Arthur. The person who eventually became the King Arthur of legend, and was considered King Arthur of history for much of the Middle Ages, he was called one of the Nine Worthies, was probably, the best we can tell, one of those original Britons. He was not a king of England, as he was later imagined. He did not have a court at Camelot. He did not have a magician named Merlin, and he did not have Knights of the Round Table, and he was not looking for a Holy Grail. What he was probably is a guy named Reothamus, that's speculation, and he was probably a guy on horseback leading a troop of mounted Britons resisting the Anglo-Saxons, and doing so unsuccessfully. But you know how tales change when they're told and retold? Over the centuries, I've taught an entire class on this subject at Vanderbilt, over the centuries, as the tale of Reothamus's last stand, like Custer's last stand, or the Alamo, gets told over and over again, he doesn't lose, he wins. And eventually, he's a great king with a court. And you can see element being added century after century in the retellings of King Arthur. He becomes a king, he gets a queen named Guinevere. There's a whole other set of tales, of sagas about various knights, including Lancelot and Percival, and they all get sort of rolled up into the King Arthur legend. There's legends of the Grail and Merlin, and they get rolled up in it too. He actually gains in height. They claim by the end of the Middle Ages that he was 7 feet tall, which would be quite a feat given nutrition at this time. So by the end of the Middle Ages, England is looking back at their great historical king. Kings and queens would even trace their ancestry back to Arthur, the great original king of England. It's kind of ironic, though, that these are Anglo-Saxons in England, tracing their ancestry back to this glorious king who was not Anglo-Saxon. He was a Celtic Briton, attempting to keep the Anglo-Saxons from taking over his land. Well, I want to end this lecture by giving you an idea of what Anglo-Saxon or Old English sounded like. You might be surprised at how foreign the language looks and sounds. Unlike more recent forms of English, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in Middle English, or Shakespeare, who is actually modern English, though early modern English, Old English has to be learned as a foreign language, essentially. There are only a few words on that page that you can recognize. Or, he, they were pronounced differently, but they meant essentially the same thing. And if you look at some words, you might even recognize some cognates almighty in there. And this is exactly what I did in graduate school. With Professor Janet Erickson at Vanderbilt, I spent a semester studying Anglo-Saxon grammar and vocabulary, and semester 2 of the Anglo-Saxon sequence is Beowulf. You translate all of Beowulf out of Anglo-Saxon into modern English. Good times. So this is Caedmon's hymn. We're actually going to spend a lot of time with Caedmon's hymn. We're going to use this early, probably 6th or 7th century bit of Old English to teach us a lot of things. It will teach us how Old English was pronounced, what sounds the letters made, it will teach us the form of early Germanic poetry, because there's no iambic pentameter here and there are no rhymes. It did other things as poetic devices. And because this is a religious poem, we're going to use it to see how the Anglo-Saxons imagined God. So here is Caedmon's hymn in the West Saxon dialect of Old English, because there were many dialects, in the best I can do to recreate what we think it would have sounded like. Nu shulan herian, heovon reaches word, meotoris meachta, and is modjethank, weorg wuldur fader, swahe wunderet jehwas echedrichten or onstelde, he ers cheop eordan bearno, heovon rova, halli shippen. Da middanjard, monkunes weard, echedrichten, after teoda, firum foldan, freya almichti. I should point out, by the way, that the capital letters, as well as the punctuation, are my editorial additions. And even though as we will see, the poetry was written and conceived in half lines with a sort of caesura or space in the middle, it was not written that way. It was written continuously across the page. So that also is something I've added to the text. Because we're going to spend so much time with this text, I actually want you to learn it. So let's go through again. I'll read a half line and then pause, and I want you to repeat after me. You might actually at this point close your eyes because some of the letters have different sounds today than what they did in the Anglo-Saxon times. So listen and repeat after me. Nu shulon herian. Heovon reaches word. Meotodes meachta. And his modja thank. Weork wuldur fader. Swahe wundre jehwas. Etche drichten. Or onstelde. He eres cheop. Eordan bearno. Heovon tohrova. Halli shippend. Tha middanjard. Mon kunes weard. Echedrichten. After Theoda. Firum foldan. Freya almichti.